Welcome back. We're going to start our second segment today on campaign finance reform. We're again joined by our rock star, Peter Wallison, author of Better Parties, Better Government. And for those of you that joined us during the first segment, what we did is, I don't know if demystify is a little too strong here, but the average person doesn't like campaign finance. They don't like how they think it affects the system. But Peter and his partner, Joel Gora, they've drilled down and they've pushed past this veneer of what the average person may think is the problem with campaign finance reform, and they've taken this to a whole new place. What they're focusing on is the element of competitiveness, how you get better candidates to run for office, and this whole notion of the fact that the campaign finance laws are basically driven to protect the incumbents. And we analyze on the first show how that happens and why the system has really inured to the benefit of the incumbents. What we promised to talk about today are some of the solution sets, because the book does a really nice job, I think, of drilling down and explaining some available solutions and perhaps how to get there. Maybe a better place to start, though, is to talk about some of the solutions that aren't solutions. For instance, people think, well, if we got the money out of it and government just paid for it, or people did this voluntary contribution thing, and we took the bad money and just pushed it back over there, everything could be okay. But I think your book does a nice job of explaining that's probably not going to solve the problem.
No, it will not solve the problem. In fact, it's probably likely to make the problem worse. What we saw with campaign finance reform beginning when it began in 1974 was that, and incidentally, it was originally introduced as a response to what happened in Watergate. Right? It was supposed to really clean up the act in Watergate.
Let's go back to Watergate.
These were part of the Watergate reforms.
Okay.
But what it did was, and this is important for your question, what it did was restrict the amount that candidates could spend on election. There are two parts to the whole campaign finance issue. One is contributions, and the other is expenditures. And what the Watergate, so-called Watergate reforms, the amendments that were adopted in 1974, did was say candidates can only spend a limited amount on their campaigns.
If they take the public money?
No.
Oh,
in general,
okay.
They could only spend a certain amount on their campaigns. Now, if you want to think of an incumbent protection provision that is the most powerful, it would be that. Because the only way that a challenger has a chance to defeat an incumbent is by spending money, so he or she becomes known to the voters. Here's the Reform Congress in 1974 trying to reform the finance campaign laws. They provide that one of the restrictions that they're imposing is that no one can spend more than a certain amount on the campaign. Sounds even-handed, of course, because it applies to both candidates and challengers, but when you think about it, you can see what a tremendous benefit it is for incumbents, because they're already known.
Their name recognition is there already.
They already are known. So
the franking privilege you talked about and everything else.
And they have an office in the district, and they have they have staff in Washington that helps them out. All of those things are fine. We wouldn't challenge those things. It's important for the candidate, the incumbent, to have a way to communicate with his or her constituents. So all that's fine. But it does amount to tremendous benefits for incumbents. And what does Congress do the first time it has an opportunity to impose reform? It says you're limited in the amount that you can spend on your campaign. It was a very small amount. I think it was something like $70,000 would be the total amount that anyone can spend on a campaign. Well, fortunately, when that got to the Supreme Court struck it down. They said, look, we can understand limits on contributions because, all right, it might look as though when a candidate is receiving a lot of money from a special interest of some kind, that there's some corruption going on here. So if you're trying to prevent corruption, we can affirm limits on contributions. But limits on expenditures, we can't affirm that because that would make it very difficult for anyone ever to defeat an incumbent. It's already difficult enough, said the court, to impose a limit on expenditures would be the worst thing that would happen here. So this is one of the reasons why I and many, many other people are very concerned about the government providing the financing for campaigns, because who is making that law? It's Congress. They are going to make a law that looks on the surface as though it is fair to everybody, but in fact it has to be favorable to incumbents. If they say, for example, well, the government will provide for each candidate $300,000 to run in a congressional district. Fair, right? $300,000 for the government, for the incumbent, $300,000 for the challenger. Well, that's not exactly fair, because the incumbent already has tremendous advantages that I outlined before. So, although it has a facial appearance of fairness, it actually turns out to be incumbent protection. So the whole idea that government might provide the financing is on its face favorable to incumbents. And then there's a First Amendment question. And in the first segment here, we talked about the fact that the real purpose of the First Amendment, it's important for a lot of things, but the real fundamental purpose that the founders must have had in mind was the voters should get as much information as they can possibly get before the elections. The incumbents don't want that, but that's what the founding fathers seem to want. And so if we are really observing the policy that is underlying the First Amendment to our Constitution, we would make sure that as much money can be spent on campaigns as is necessary, as seen by the people involved in the campaigns, to achieve office.
Don't you have another problem with these government finance options with some of these incredibly wealthy candidates that are coming on board now, and they have the right to spend their own resources, correct? Mm-hmm. You can't limit a person's willingness to spend money on their own resources.
That was another, I'm glad you raised that, because this is a beautiful little story. That was another one of the restrictions in 1974 that Congress put in, and that is that no person could spend more than $70,000 on his own election. Now, if the whole objective here was to prevent corruption, why can't a person spend as much as he wants on his own election, since he can't corrupt himself? You want to allow him to spend as much as he wants. Of course, the Supreme Court saw it the same way and struck it down. But in 2002, when there were further amendments to the original campaign finance law, Congress introduced something called the millionaire provision. In the millionaire provision, if an incumbent is facing a candidate who can spend $350,000 of his own money on the campaign, the incumbent then is relieved of many of the restrictions on the size of the contributions he can receive or she can receive.
Another incumbency protection.
Right. It's so obviously an incumbent protection provision. It's really quite striking that they would even do it, that they had the nerve to do it. But it just shows what this is all about. This is all about protecting incumbents. And so we go back to this question of government financing. No way, because what will happen to the American people is that the amount of information they will get will be limited, because incumbents don't want them to get as much information as possible. That's against their interests.
So what you're really trying to get at, I think, in your book here, is you're trying to break this cycle of incumbency protection. And one way you see to do that is to re-empower the party. Mm-hmm. Now, some people might not like that. Some people already think the parties are empowered too much, and giving them this additional power is not the way to go. Right. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think that is a really legitimate question, and one that we have to wrestle with a bit. There are several sides to this question. I believe in competition. I believe in competition in the private sector. I believe in the market system for exactly that reason. I think it lowers prices, it creates innovation, all kinds of things like that when people compete. So if it works in the market system, it also would work in politics. We want the most competition we can possibly get. And that's why I have been looking for a way of financing challengers to incumbents. And the only way that seems to be fair and reasonable is to allow the parties, the political parties, to finance their candidates in a way that they cannot. Under the first section, when we talked first, I pointed out that by statute, the political parties cannot finance their candidates except to a very limited degree. And it turns out that for House and Senate races, that direct financing from the party to the candidate amounts to about 1% of the total cost of running a campaign. So the parties are already very severely limited in what they can provide. So how would we make campaigns more competitive? We could enable the parties to provide the financing. Now, what that will do is to make parties more powerful. And if people are afraid of political parties, that's something to consider. The parties will be more powerful. But would the parties impose very strict philosophical or ideological positions on their candidates? My view of that is no. What the parties want to do is to get a majority in Congress, a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate. And how do you do that? You have to put forth a candidate who has a philosophical view that fits with the district he or she is running in. So the inclinations of the parties will be to find candidates who are in the middle, because we know that the best chance you have of winning in almost any constituency, not all, of course, but in almost any, is to get the broad middle and take the people who will vote for the party's candidate under any circumstances, but then pick up the independents in the middle between left and right. And so the likelihood is when the parties are financing candidates, they will have a lot of power, but they won't have the power to impose a strict ideological position on their candidates, because they know the result of that will be that they will lose more elections in the future.
I think I agree with you on the general election side, but how do you think this plays out in the primary election? You think the parties just stay out of the primaries, or do they kind of pick the horse they want in the primary now, knowing that they're going to ride that horse all the way through the general?
I think that will work this way, and we don't know exactly, but it probably will work this way, and that is that the parties will have a favorite candidate in the district. They will have the candidate they think will win. Now, they will probably not, under the laws that we are proposing, be able to finance that candidate. That candidate will have to stand on his feet, or her feet, for the primary to fight it out.
So you'd have a dichotomy almost. This set of rules you're proposing would be for the general election.
Only for the general.
Okay,
that's right.
I don't know if I missed that in the book, or you didn't emphasize it, or
It's in there.
I missed it.
Well, no, we wanted to be sure that people understood that we weren't talking about the party selecting the candidates, but the party would make clear in the district who they think would be the candidate they would like to have representing the party in that district. And that would be a big leg up for that particular candidate. So I think that's the kind of balance we'd like to achieve. We don't want the parties to have so much power as to be able to select the person who runs in a particular district, but we want them to be able to say to the people in the district, if you want this candidate to win, if you want a candidate from our party to win in this district, you should support this person because we think he would be the best candidate. If another candidate wins, we can't guarantee that we're going to be willing to finance that campaign. We may use our funds where it would be more effective in other districts. So that's the kind of balance that we have to reach. It's a difficult balance, but it does prevent the parties from becoming too powerful. If the parties become so powerful that they can attain control over the candidates completely, then I think that would be a negative.
Well, I think, as you said, if you differentiate the primary from the general, that might do it for you. What I like about what you're doing here and proposing, and you've talked about it again, is the things that are broken in the system. Part of them comes down to the fact that because of incumbency protection, we have too many congressional seats where there is no competition at all. Right. In fact, we had a guest on an earlier show who said that in the next election, they're predicting there could be as few as 30 contested congressional seats. So it's 30 contested seats out of 400 some. Right. That's not appropriate. Right. And the other thing I think I agree with you on entirely, if you have your system in place, the discussion is going to head towards the middle. Because if you have these districts now that are skewed towards one side or the other, and the other party can in fact now finance and put up a candidate, by definition, the dialogue has to get to the center.
Yes, sir.
And I think that's really what's missing here. The two prongs of this program are to talk about dysfunction and understand polarization, and it's the polarization that also is being attacked by some of your concepts here. So let's say you're right, and I like where you're going here. How do you get this done? I mean, how do you get these incumbents that have been protecting themselves to change the law in Washington to unprotect themselves?
That's very hard. But I will say that
sell more books.
There was a lot of opposition to both the 1974 amendments that protected the incumbents and what was called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002. This was the McCain-Feingold Act in 2002, which was also another incumbent protection act. The fact that it was bipartisan should tell you a lot. But there was opposition. There was pretty strong opposition to both of those. Just wasn't enough to defeat the laws in Congress. So it's a matter really of the public understanding this issue more than they have in the past, and saying, now I understand why we have this situation we have. I do not like what I see when I see candidates going to special interests and getting money from them. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that really good people will not stand for office because they don't want to have to grub for money among their friends. I don't like the fact that the special interests are the only ones who can really provide money to the candidates, and that they are protected because the incumbents have so many advantages over the challengers. I don't like all those things about the campaign finance law now. I think we ought to have a situation in which the political parties are able at least to raise the money and finance their candidates. That would look better to me. And it's not the easiest thing in the world for people to understand against all the other things that are being presented to them. But if one of the ways they think this can be solved is by having the government provide the money, I think I've provided the reasons why the government doing it would not actually help at all. In fact, it'll make things worse. So we have a whole series of possible ways that we might go. But the current system is not working well. It's dividing our politics in a very bad way. And it's incumbent protection, and there isn't enough competition. Having the government provide the financing will end up being an even stronger incumbent protection, less competition. So how do we get a system where you don't have the candidates going to the special interest for money? We don't have incumbents protected. We have much more competition. The only way that I can see to do it is how we describe it in this book, and that is to say the political parties can finance their own candidates. And I guess most people don't even know that they can't. That's the amazing thing. When the media describes what money is made available to candidates, they say that the Republican Party provides X amount of money to such and such a candidate. Democrats provide Y amount of money to such and such a candidate. But they don't say that almost all of that money that is provided by the Republicans and the Democrats is not coordinated in any way with the candidate. The candidate cannot talk to the party about what kind of polling should be done in the district, what kind of issues should be stressed in that district, whether to go for the women's vote or the men's vote or the worker vote or the nurses vote or whatever it is. The party cannot coordinate those issues with the candidate and what the candidate wants to say, because that's illegal. So almost all of the party's expenditures are uncoordinated with the candidates. Yet the media, when they talk about the support, they lump it all together.
They have to sell newspapers.
They have to sell, and it's also, as we said in the first segment,
they have to sell advertising in the newspapers for the election.
It's also give the newspapers much more power vis-a-vis the public, because it becomes the newspapers and the media generally who are really the sources that the public has to go to for this information. And so it's in their interest, too, to make it seem as though there's no campaign finance reform that is necessary to make the system work better.
One of the things I like about your theory, but again, works against my theory. My theory, we've talked, is we need a third political party. If we go your direction, that helps the third political party, because instead of their individual candidates having to aggregate money and run, the party could raise the money and launch the party.
Yeah.
But the two established parties would figure that out pretty quickly, and I think that would again work against you when you're trying to get these laws passed, because if it is about incumbency protection, then you have the incumbency protection, but you also have the two-party system protection.
Yeah.
So people are not going to want to give up all that control.
Well, I agree. I agree. It's going to be very tough, but there isn't a better solution. But I think you're right about third parties. I think third parties would be helped by something like this. But there are institutional elements in our laws that make it very hard for third parties, and for the presidency in particular, I would be worried about a third party candidacy. We can talk this over some other time, but what our current system does, the electoral system that we have with really two major party candidates and the electoral votes, is that it does tend to produce a result where one party has a majority. If we didn't have that system, if we had a whole lot of candidates, a whole lot of parties, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates, we would end up with a lot of special interest candidates. There would be a pro-choice and pro-abortion and pro-immigrant and so forth, and each of them would collect some votes, and in the end the person who's elected president would be elected only with a plurality, and that would not give the president the kind of capital, political capital, that he or she needs to have an agenda and get something adopted by Congress. So I am a little bit concerned about third parties giving them too much power, but I do agree that this system that we're talking about would enable third parties to do much more for their candidates than the current system would.
Well, thank you for your time, and what I would encourage our audience to do is get Peter's book, get another book on the topic, because there's so much about this issue that you really have to understand before you can figure out what the solutions are. And there's such a complex history to it all that you've talked about today, this, layered with the Supreme Court and incumbency protection, all these different acts. I think the person that wants to really get involved in politics owes it to themselves to spend some time again with your book or someone else's book and really know what they're talking about, and then join with your efforts to find some solutions so we can move forward here.
Good. Thank you.
All the best, Peter.
Thank you, Steve.
Always love having a rock star on the show.